Right, time to get the Conservatives' response to the spending review yesterday and indeed the GDP data earlier this morning. We're joined now by the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, Will.
What is your take on that GDP print?
So, very disappointing, well below what economists were fearing already, which was a contraction. And I think it just speaks to the mismanagement of the economy, I'm afraid. Government that's come in, put a lot of taxes on businesses, which has destroyed growth, gone out and spent a lot of money, which has been inflationary. We've seen interest rates higher for longer. And, of course, it's all adding to this national debt, upon which the servicing costs alone are £100 billion a year. That's twice what we spend on defence. So they're building a very fragile economy. I think that's the root of the problem, and we're seeing that now in the figures that we've just had.
I don't know if we can bring up the chart again that we just showed, but obviously the first quarter was quite strong. As the Chancellor was pointing out, GDP data can be volatile month on month. Would we have expected April to be soft anyway because of Liberation Day and the tariffs?
So there are all sorts of things in play. I think what you should look at probably is what the IMF and the OBR and the Bank of England and others are saying about the growth forecasts. And those have all been downgrades, and certainly compared to when we were in power and the plans that we had. So the OBR, for example, has halved its forecast for growth this year. And that, as I say, is driven by the choices that this government has made to tax businesses, tax jobs, wealth creation, the things that expand the economy, and to focus on spending and borrowing a lot of money, which of course in turn means higher inflation, higher interest rates, and these huge servicing costs on this ever spiralling national debt that we have.
In terms of overall strategy, clearly this government has decided to have an expansionary fiscal policy, which means spending is higher than it would have been had you guys won the election. Is it not fair to try that, but after what was, I think fair to say, fairly lacklustre growth for most of your party's time in government? And with it, is it not fair to say that the effects of the tax increases will come first and the spending plans will come down the line?
Well, I think the root of this, Wilf, is a question, which is, can the economy, as it is now, withstand the kind of borrowing that this government is creating? And the answer is no. And where we see that is if you look at the fiscal headroom that the Chancellor had in her autumn budget last year, all of that and more was blown. She rebuilt it in her spring statement, but most economists now believe that that will have disappeared again in the autumn, and that we'll actually be looking at further tax increases to try and fill the hole that she's created. When you're in that kind of predicament, particularly facing tariffs from overseas, particularly facing pressures on perhaps spending more on defence going down the line, particularly when you've U-turned on winter fuel payments in an unfunded way, so that money has got to be found at the budget that's coming, and what's going on in the bond markets, which is, you know, they are watching very closely our country and the basis on which they're going to lend to us, and rates could be going up, let's see. When you put all of that together, you end up in a very precarious situation where you should not be adding fuel to the fire with massive borrowing.
I guess another way of framing the question is to ask whether you commend the long-term investment projects. And I guess with that, acknowledgement that these are investments that clearly the Chancellor's making because she believes they will help the country in the long term, even if they don't immediately give her good monthly data prints. You know, nuclear power stations, which, you know, as we all, I think, understand, Boris Johnson wanted to get going but was delayed on with Sizewell C. Do you commend long-term investment plans like that might not even bear fruit for them this Parliament?
So everybody wants to invest in our economy in a way that will create a more productive and a faster growing economy, absolutely. But you can only do it on the basis that you can afford to do it given the economy at a particular point in time. And my point is they've mismanaged it. Now, how should they have managed it? Well, the first thing is they should have taken different choices fiscally, so they shouldn't have loaded up taxes on businesses and gone on a borrowing and spending splurge and driving up inflation and interest rates and so on and destroying growth. Secondly, they should have concentrated on productivity. So they gave 14% pay rise to the train drivers, 22% to junior doctors, not one string attached to those settlements in terms of demanding greater efficiency. And thirdly, they should have gripped welfare spending. And that's what they've singularly failed to do. We had already done that in office. We'd saved $5 billion from the welfare budget, and the OBR had scored that. to see 450,000 fewer people going on to long-term sickness benefits and on that journey into work, and we could help them to do that. All of that was scrapped by this government. And if you take those choices, that's why you end up in the kind of position that we're seeing now.
Obviously, on your point about doctors' wages, for example, strikes were ended and waiting lists have been down somewhat impressively. So there's that too.
But the unions are coming back for more.
Well, we'll see. If we had picket lines going again, we could frame that. But things like Sizewell C, you pleased to see that? Things like affordable housing?
We had big plans, in fact, even more ambitious plans to invest in nuclear, because nuclear is undoubtedly one of the ways through the problems that we have, both in terms of energy security, but also in terms of the cost of our energy, which is 7 times what it is in China, 4 times what it is in the US and Canada, and you can't compete on that basis. So long-term nuclear and small modular reactors as well, absolutely, and we had clear, ambitious plans for that. But I keep coming back to the same point, that in the whole, in the round, what you're looking at with this government is vast borrowings, which I'm afraid I don't think are going to be sustainable given the kind of economy we've got. And I do worry about the bond markets in the more medium to longer term.
We could always dwell and look backwards, but I think it's fair to say that debt to GDP is where it is now in a painful way because of the debt that was accumulated over the prior decade. Yes, borrowing might be a little bit higher today relative to had you won the election, but we're at 100% of GDP and thereabouts, and we were at the end of your government either way.
So what we were doing when we were in office was have a clear target to get debt down as a percentage of GDP. The first thing that Rachel Reeves did, although she said she would not do this during the run-up to the election, was to change the fiscal target. So she made it easier to borrow more money. And in fact, if you look at the fiscal rules that we had on debt when we were in office, she is failing those badly. Debt is going up. And what we need to be doing is getting it down.
But did debt go up every single year of your government? Yes.
So
there was a deficit every single year.
Well, if you go way back to 2010, we inherited a deficit which was over 10% of GDP, and that was from the previous Labour government. And of course, when you're running a deficit of that size, debt is going to go up as you get on top of it. By just before the pandemic, actually, we had a turning point then in terms of debt coming down. But then, of course, we had COVID, and we had the Ukraine-Russia war, the inflation that was imported to our shores and other countries. We weren't unique. And we had to step in. It cost about £400 billion in order to do that, to preserve jobs. And if we went back in time to when COVID shrank the economy by 10% overnight, everybody was prophesying mass unemployment like we would never have seen before. We stepped in at cost, admittedly, but it was the right thing to do to protect the British economy, jobs and families up and down the country.
Mel Stride, thanks for joining us this morning. Good to see you.
Thank you, Will.